One of the things that Harvey points out in his companion and in the lecture is that Marx so often talked about like class struggle and stuff. So why doesn't he start Capital like talking about class struggle or the class structure or something like that, rather than the commodity? But he starts talking about the commodity first because we literally all deal with commodities on a daily basis, and we have an experience with them, whether it's a hairbrush or a computer or whatever. So definitionally, commodity is basically anything that satisfies human need through its physical properties and is traded with something else of equal value. So like the examples I just said, like it could be a hairbrush, it could be a computer, it could be a head of broccoli, head of lettuce, whatever.
It's literally everything.
Literally everything. But another distinction is that it could also include raw materials like wood or linen or anything that can then be used to create another commodity. And then commodities both have a qualitative aspect, which is the physical properties of that commodity. And then there's the quantitative aspect, which is like how many. So like 10 yards of linen equals one coat or whatever.
Mm-hmm. The magnitude versus, the actual quality that thing possesses, right?
So, and one phrase that he kind of uses right off the bat, and that he, I guess, uses throughout the book, is he uses the word appears often. And when he uses, it's important to remember that when he uses the word appears, it doesn't mean necessarily that something is. He's implying that like something else is going on beneath that surface appearance, and then it kind of relates later to fetishism, which I guess we'll talk about today a little bit also. But as far as commodities, is there anything else you want to say as far as like definitionally commodities? I mean, it's kind of straightforward. Like everybody knows what a fucking commodity is, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I just want to say that, like, I think that was a good starting place for him to do, since he, like you said, everybody has an experience with commodity, because that's literally how we run our entire lives. Every table, every piece, every shirt we wear, every piece of food we stick in our mouth is we bought, paid for. Somewhere else it was, was produced and it was brought to a market, right? And that's essentially what a commodity is. I guess I just want to point out that like we are utilizing Harvey's lectures, as a supplement for this. So I don't want to take away from that at all. This is a lot of our stuff. We're trying to bring some originality to it, but we are a product of these different materials. But to that point, that this first chapter was kind of a behemoth to get through, in the sense of he's just inundating you with a lot of new terminology that you have to kind of learn. That's just not in the normal lingo, and that was something that when you tackle this book, you have to kind of grapple with at the beginning. But it's important because he's essentially setting kind of these definitional terms, so that as you go through the book, he's consistently referring back to these same terms, and once you understand what they mean, he builds his analysis upon them. So that's, I just wanted to mention that. But yeah, let's talk about the three major terms.
It kind of, I mean, it's the first chapter is very convoluted, and it does get to be a little bit of a snooze fest when he starts like talking about like 10 yards of linen equals this, and whatever.
Right.
But yeah, once you know what he's talking about and it's summarized, then I think it makes more sense. So then he goes into that every commodity has three types of values to it, which is use value, exchange value, and then value itself. And differentiating between those things kind of lays the foundation for the rest of Capital, I guess. So use value is the actual utility of an object, which is the qualitative aspect. So this bottle holds water, and that's its use value, and then I'm able to drink water from it, and that's its use value to me, is I'm able to drink. The exchange value then is the quantitative aspect when comparing it to other commodities. So again, the example he constantly uses is 10 yards of linen is that quantitative aspect, and then it exchanges for one coat. So it's the quantitative aspect, and that value is created by humans, and the relation between those two commodities or products are that they're both products of labor, since their qualitative aspects are different. So like obviously 10 yards of linen doesn't have the same use value as like one coat does, but 10 yards of linen has the same exchange value as one coat. Yeah, realize through the human labor that goes into creating a commodity and giving it use value, i.e. Like combining wood with stone then creates a hatchet or a hammer or something like that.
Mhm.
Something important, I think, to point out is that Marx is obviously talking about the capitalist system, but labor creating use value isn't necessarily specific to capitalism. So, like somebody can create something or like grow a plant or something like that, and it creates use value for themselves or their tribe or something like that.
Mhm.
But if it's not traded in a market environment or in a market, then it's not a commodity. So.
Mhm.
So I grow serrano peppers in my balcony. I eat them for myself. I give them to you guys, but I'm not selling them to you for money or exchanging it for something else. So then it's not considered like a commodity.
One of the things that a lot of people have to kind of start doing when they're reading this or learning about this is kind of separating, those three concepts out, because a lot of people, when they think value, they think about something completely different. But in Marxist terms, the word value is that exact thing you just said, is socially, which he uses later, socially necessary labor time, right? The amount of time put into the product, which is, and we'll get into this later on in our discussion, but basically the foundation of the labor theory of value, right? That all value is inherently the result of human labor, right? And we'll get into too in chapter 2 how he kind of actually somewhat changes it a little bit, right? Because he ends up saying that really value is only real value if somebody else needs it and then somebody else pays it for you, right? Or realization of that commodity. But yeah, I just wanted to mention also that use value, not only is it it's a form of utility, but it's something that you end up consuming, right? It's not something you end up trading for something else. It's something that you actually consume for yourself. And I thought your example of the serrano pepper is perfect. Like that is something that is literally just a use value. You grew it yourself, you produced it, but you didn't bring it to a market. You didn't sell it to us. You're just like, hey, I grew some serrano peppers, and you guys can use them, and we consume them. We don't turn around and then sell it. And then just pointing out the fact that again, you're emphasizing that every commodity has these things, these embodied in it. And this is kind of the first foundations that we get of Marx's dialectic, right? Of pointing out the contradictions that are inherent to the different kind of concepts within capitalism, right? And the first one that he gets introduced to is this dichotomy between use value and exchange value. You care about a house and its use value, and that it protects you and offers you shelter. But then there's this kind of force that you fight against too. It's like, I also care about what I can exchange my house for eventually for money.
People are confused by what he's referring to as the dialectic. Do you want to mention for a second like what he means, and maybe take it back to like system dynamics and things like that?
Well, I think my understanding of the dialectic is it's a form of essentially analysis and investigation, but in the specific Hegelian and Marxist term, it's a form of trying to find the contradictions in things, because there's, taking it back to Hegel, he had this whole idea of like every single being, and a being could either be a person, a system, a seed, literally anything has kind of this inherent form, its first being, and then within it has this contradiction, its non-being. And then when you resolve that contradiction, you end up creating a synthesis. And that's the last kind of transformation of whatever original being you started with. And then you go back and you circle back around to, okay, now this new synthesis will have its own contradiction. And that's essentially what the entirety of Capital is. And Harvey goes into this tremendously, and maybe later on I'll share my screen and we can actually show the diagram that Harvey provides, because it's a very good visualization of this concept. But getting back to our example of use value and exchange value, that's the first kind of dialectical contradiction, right? That you have a product and it has use value and exchange value, but then it kind of coalesces back the synthesis into value, and then value splits up again into other things, into what we'll get into later, which is concrete versus abstract, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my understanding of what it is. It's kind of a method of analysis that starts off with some, I guess, point of the starting point of the analysis, and then starts to break it down into these contradictions until you get to some endpoint, which, there is never an endpoint, right? But that's one of the things that I do enjoy about Marxism, is its commitment to change, to dynamism, to that it's not a static analysis, which is something that neoclassical, or what Marxists and Marx himself like to call bourgeois economics, that
Mhm.
they're in love with, static equilibrium analysis, but, no system is ever in equilibrium. No
Right.
system is ever in these perfect states of supply and demand. It's literally always in flux, always in a state
Right.
of change. And that's what I like.
And that's something I think, as far as Marx's analysis, I think his analysis is kind of based around the idea of or based around the concept of when the market is in equilibrium, and that's kind of where his analysis comes from. But the market is really never in equilibrium. Just one last point about value, and as far as unskilled labor, so value again comes from exchange value, and it's realized through the human labor that goes into a commodity. But that doesn't mean that an unskilled worker who takes longer in creating something gives an item more use value. So an example is like building a house. So like you give me you tell me to build a house. I'm not an architect. I'm not a construction worker. It's going to take me freaking 20 years to build a house. That doesn't mean that the house then has more use value after taking me 20 years to build it versus like taking a year to build it by like a construction worker or something like that. And then one thing that impacts the labor time, obviously over time, is new technologies and manufacturing. The key so far, a thing can have use value without having value. So when an object's utility has nothing to do with human labor, such as air, like air has use value to all of us because we all breathe it in, but there wasn't any human labor that went into creating air, right? And then value is experienced through exchange value that's then tied to labor.
I'll say right here, we're not Marxist apologists. We're definitely looking at this text critically, and we're going to be pulling in other sources of information, primarily, Professor Stephen Keen's work and others that critique Marx's work. But one of the things that I want to point out is the fact that this idea, this concept of value, right? That is the socially necessary labor time, that it's created by humans, and it's realized when you actually exchange it for something else. It doesn't include this idea of wealth, and what I mean by that is its fundamental nature of being based in natural resources and based in the concept of energy, which I'll get into more later. And at first I was very critical in the sense of like, I was like, how can this guy just talk about, capital and labor and not talk about the things where both, the thing that they have in common, or what I believe they have in common, what Professor Keen thinks they have in common, which is the idea that, you need energy to run both labor and capital. But later on throughout the text, Marx does kind of mention it offhand, where he says, labor is therefore not the only source of material wealth of use value in process. As William Petty says, labor is the father of material wealth and earth is its mother. So, again, Marx is kind of distinguishing between wealth and value here. And it seems like he's aware that earth is responsible for, part of the equation. But he doesn't really seem very interested in it. He's just kind of, very focused on this idea of human labor and the consequences of organizing production around commodities and the consequences for human labor because of that. But he completely disregards or just kind of assumes away this idea of the earth providing the source of material wealth. And the reason I mention it is because I think that this is kind of a critical flaw in Marxist analysis that has real theoretical repercussions, because I think without including energy, you subject your system, your theoretical system, to kind of these what end up being absurd notions of growth, right? And what I think, surrounding your analysis or beginning your analysis with the understanding that both of these things, capital and labor, originate in the natural resources of the earth, grounds you in a real physical limit that has important ramifications later down the line, which I'll get into towards the end of our discussion.
Yeah. One quote actually from the companion, Harvey's companion, is that Marx understood wealth to mean what we need to live, survive, and thrive, as distinct from value, which is a characteristic we assign to commodities and is socially constructed. So I guess definitionally, wealth would be the total use values at one's command. And then value is the socially necessary labor time that the use values represent. It gets a little kind of confusing, and I'm honestly still a little confused. I understand the distinction, but it's still like linguistically, it kind of is a little strange. Yeah.
Definitely a little still confusing. But I think what he's saying there is there's a difference, right? There's a difference where, which is a necessary consequence, right? I'm sorry, I know I'm being a little ambiguous here. What I mean is that we've organized our society to be this commodity production society. And because of that, we're organizing around this concept of value instead of the concept of wealth and use value. Whereas use values, as you just said in that quote, is how we survive and thrive, right? Whereas use value or value doesn't take that necessarily into account. It's just about, okay, this is how much socially necessary labor that this thing took to produce, and this is how much money I end up being able to exchange it for. But we haven't organized our society around, okay, how can we provide the greatest material wealth and well-being for our society? And that I think is what is the true crux of my critique, is that I think if Marx started, with this idea of the natural resources, maybe he would have gotten to a different set of conclusions. But again, we'll see where we go. We're not on top. We're only in chapter 2, right, in this book. Right. So we'll see.
All right. So kind of getting into that, he talks about that labor has this twofold nature, and then he refers to it as abstract labor versus concrete labor. Kind of going back, so let's compare like a chair versus a loaf of bread, and as far as like the value in them. Like if it takes 10 times as long to make a chair as it does a loaf of bread, then the chair is 10 times more valuable, right? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to abstract versus concrete labor, he distinguishes both that they're unified in the act of laboring, but baking, for example, when it comes to the bread, baking is the type of concrete labor that results in bread. But an hour's worth of abstract labor determines that the value of the bread is proportional, with a tenth of the value of a chair, because the chair, I guess, takes longer to make, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, you don't necessarily trade like tailoring for mechanics. When you go to the store, you don't like go to the mechanic and say like, "Hey, I'm a tailor, fix your jacket or something." You don't trade the concrete labor for the concrete labor. You trade like an hour for an hour. So, hey, I'm a tailor. It's going to take me an hour to mend your jacket. It's going to take you an hour to change my oil, whatever. Then those two things, exchange, and they both have equal exchange value. So I guess abstract labor then translates into exchange value, and then concrete labor translates into the use value of a commodity. That's my understanding of abstract first. It took me a while to kind of wrap my head around that, but then I found that example of the bread and the chair, and then just saying basically that the actual like baking, the act of baking is the concrete labor, and then the hour's worth of baking is the abstract labor.
Right. And this was kind of, again, just to point it out to the audience, like this is another example of the dialectic, right? So just to kind of put it for you, we've gone from use value and exchange value coalescing into value, and now we're splitting that again into concrete labor and abstract labor, okay? And this was also kind of a weird, kind of ambiguous, kind of very abstract thing that I had to wrap my head around. Like to your point, concrete labor is kind of the actual act of making the commodity into some sort of use value, right? Like the act of weaving to turn it into linen, that's the concrete labor, or the act of tailoring to create the coat, that's the act of concrete labor, right? And those are use values, the use values of the coat and the use value of the linen. Where you get this abstract concept of labor, from what I understand, is like when like what you just said, the actual method of exchange, right? So the coat ends up being the expression of the use value of the linen in its abstract form, because at the end of the day, it's all labor, and then vice versa, right? The code can also be expressed in the abstract labor of the linen. And that's kind of what this whole, like that section of the book, it kind of starts devolving into these, what I understood is these kind of like linguistic analysis of like language and how we actually say things when you're relating commodities to commodities. And we'll get to that in a minute.
The relative form, and then what's the other form?
Relative and equivalent.
An equivalent form. So yeah, like you're saying, linguistically, I guess the relative form is just the first object in the equation, and then the equivalent form is the second object. So 10 yards of linen is the relative form, and then 1 coat is the so what is it?
The equivalent form.
But I guess if you were to reverse that, then I mean,
it's backwards.
One coat is the relative form to the equivalent form being 10 yards of linen, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and to pause right here, because I think this is when it kind of starts getting a little crazy. And again, this is another separation, right, of the dialectic between the equivalent and the relative form of commodities. But I think the reason why Marx goes through this entire process, he's trying to get to a specific point, which is the money commodity, or the money form. But he's taking you through this as like kind of this like logical kind of argument to take you in there. He doesn't just like, hey, let's talk about money. He's trying to get you to that point. And that's why I think he goes on this long tirade of explaining all these things and starts with the butter economy. But yeah, again, to emphasize, it's a very kind of linguistic understanding, like literally what we just talked about, the equation. When you're looking at something, when you're discussing it at something, when you're saying, hey, I got 20 yards of linen and I'm trying to get a coat, you're saying, I might have my yards of linen, but I'm trying to get the equivalent of it in the form of a coat, and and that's because you're starting with linen and you're trying to get to a coat, but it could go vice versa. And then he starts to kind of expand on this, and he calls these things the value equations, right? So he kind of starts with the simple form of that, which is the one we keep mentioning over and over again, which is just literally one commodity is equal to another commodity. But then he starts saying, well, we can expand upon this, which he calls the expanded form of the value equation, right? Where you can start saying, okay, well, if 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat, it could also be equal to 5 pounds of coffee, which could also be equal to whatever 5 I don't know, 5 bushels of wine or whatever, you know what I mean? And you can like keep doing this forever, these different, like this is equal to this or equal to this or equal to that or equal to that. And then he finally gets to the, which I believe he calls, let me reference my notes here, the general form of value, right? Which is the understanding that the original 20 yards of linen is exchanging for its equivalent in all other commodities, right? So, the general form, 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat or is equal to 40 pounds of coffee or equal to whatever, is all happening at the same time. So that's what kind of ends up creating the money form, which we can talk about now if you want to talk a little bit.
Yeah, sure. One other quick thing on labor, just that if we kind of never really defined socially necessary labor time. So socially necessary labor time definitionally is the amount of labor time performed by a worker of average skill and productivity working with the tools of the average productive potential to produce a given commodity. So, and to that effect, if that like necessary labor time doubles, then the value of the commodity doubles, and vice versa. So if it takes twice as long to create a coat, then that coat is then valued twice as much, and vice versa. If it takes half the time based on new technology or whatever, then that coat is then worth half as much. He basically states that then the exchange value is then realized through the money form, and because money doesn't contain qualitative characteristics. I mean, Marx kind of disagrees, I guess, to an extent of this, saying that if money is backed by gold, and gold, still has a certain amount of labor that goes into like mining gold or whatever. But anyway, because money doesn't contain qualitative characteristics or like intrinsic use value, then using money to measure commodities disregards the labor that went into their creation or their qualitative characteristics. So the money basically solely conveys their exchange values. And that I believe this is still in chapter 1. He kind of talks about this, the fetishism of commodities and of money. And that fetishism kind of refers to how that labor is disguised in commodities. So for example, when you go to the supermarket and you see a head of lettuce, you see your money, you see how much it's going to cost, and you make decisions based on that info. And that's kind of where he keeps referring to, like, where things appear as they are, right? So like it's basically impossible to know like anything about like the labor or the laborers that went into like creating the commodity, or went into like farming the lettuce. And that's kind of the fetishism. He doesn't refer to fetishism in any like sexual term or anything like that. It's like a completely different understanding. It's more like a disguise, like that we have with commodities, because we don't see the labor that went into it. You just see the exchange value for the commodity. You could definitely dive more onto the money form though.
Yeah. So just to kind of piggyback off what you were saying, again, this kind of goes back to what we originally started with, that Marx is kind of interested in these social relations, right? And the money form ends up kind of hiding those social relations. So, he goes through this long-winded analysis on barter exchange, and that's essentially what that kind of part of the text is, when he goes on these, crazy tangents about explaining all these different value equations. Is to show first and foremost that human beings are behind these commodities, right? And then we enter into these exchanges, which are social relations to exchange these commodities. And so we're effectively saying to each other, hey, I know how to do a certain service or a certain thing. I know how to program, or I know how to build a house, or hey, I've made this coat or whatever, and then we go to each other and we're like, what can I get for this in return? Because this has no use value to me. This, I need to get other things. And these are social relations. But what ends up happening is, this obviously becomes untenable or kind of impossible to keep track of or really organize a society around large, barter exchange. And to kind of devolve a little bit, first of all, point out that, again, Marx, what he's doing here is a logical argument on how to get to the money form. So he's explaining these like simple value equations and expanding it and then getting to the money form. But it's literally a logical argument. It's not a historical one. And just to kind of quickly divulge here, the money actually originated in a completely different way historically, and if we refer to David Graeber's work, the anthropologist, his research shows, money was actually created as a form to maintain armies that are in conquest in different lands. And what he means by that is that essentially when, for example, Rome or something, sent an army off to conquer Egypt, when you think about it, how did Rome maintain an army so far away? And, obviously they had these great trade routes in place where they could transport food and other things to these armies. But that wasn't always the case, or it would take a very, very long time. So how do you keep all of these men fed and clothed in service? Well, what these people did was, or the kings of the time of the emperors, they impose a tax on their conquered populace. And they say, okay, now that you've conquered, you need to now pay us for the privilege of being alive, essentially. And the way you're going to do that is you need to give us, money. And the way they got the money in their hands, meaning the conquered populace, was from the soldiers. So the kings and the emperors would mint coins, give them to the soldiers in the form of wages, and then the soldiers would exchange those coins for services and goods from the conquered populace. And then the conquered populace would then take those accumulated coins and then give it back in the form of a tax. So that's really the original form of money, and it's essentially a form of violence, right? So that's how originally was created. And that's the historical argument. I just wanted to point that out because I know, we may get like arguments like that's not really how money was created. Right, that's absolutely true. However, and this is something that Graeber also points out, is that it still doesn't take away from two things. One, when you're talking about small communities, There's this kind of like bourgeois notion that like it would, everybody just bartered and exchanged, and then barter in exchange was this like very hard, convoluted process of like, okay, if I'm raising cows, but I need a spear, and I go to you, the spear maker, like, yo, I'll give you a cow for 5 spears. And you're like, I don't need a cow. So like, I have to go find somebody who needs a cow, exchange it for something else, and whatever. And then eventually that's what money came from. Mm-hmm. That's not really true, obviously, because that, how small communities actually exchange goods was based off of debt and credit. We all knew each other. We all trusted each other. However, when you start trying to exchange goods with other communities who you don't know and don't trust, you suddenly can't like make these kind of debt obligations and contracts with them, right? You have to you have to do it some way. You have to settle those debts some other way. So that's where the money form comes into as well, and that's still within the context of Marxism. And that's essentially where Marx's argument ends up being, is like, eventually, not only do these exchanges end up being too complicated to keep track of, but you need some sort of form of universal equivalent, because you don't trust everybody that you come into contact with. And that's what the money form ends up being, is a form of universal equivalence. And that's the main other point that I want to talk about, is the universal equivalency of money. It's a way to say, hey, instead of talking about these 20 yards of linen exchanging for all of these different products in the expanded form of the value equation, you can just simply bring it back and say, well, I can take 20 yards of linen and exchange it for €2. And you want to go off
that kind of brings us into chapter 2. I guess one thing I'll say then about like value and like how money disguises the labor value in things is one quote from Harvey is, he says, to find value in a commodity by just looking at a commodity is like trying to find gravity in a stone. It only exists in relations between commodities and only gets expressed materially in the contradictory and problematic form of the money commodity.